Hi, I'm Marcin Kuśmierczyk. Welcome to Eastern Insights. Why does Eastern Europe's perspective on global affairs matter? Because here, history and geopolitics collide in ways that shape our world. Yet these voices often go unheard. This podcast bridges this gap. Each episode translates in-depth analysis from my Polish YouTube channel, Polityka Zagraniczna, which means international politics. For the last few years, this platform has dissected foreign policy, security, and the forces shaping Eastern Europe. Using AI tools like 11 Labs, we adapt these nuanced insights into English, preserving their depth while making them accessible to all. Whether we're unpacking Russia's latest moves, EU debates, or security challenges in Central Europe, our mission is simple: to foster informed dialogue by sharing Eastern Europe's untold stories. If you're curious about the world beyond headlines, subscribe now. Join me as we decode the complexities of global affairs, one Eastern European insight at a time.
Today, we're diving into a topic that might sound like it's straight out of the Cold War playbook, but it's very much a part of our current reality: nuclear weapons. Recently, something quite remarkable happened in Poland. Leaders from across the political spectrum, both the Prime Minister and the President, started publicly discussing nuclear weapons. This bold move to break the taboo surrounding this issue is, in my opinion, a clear sign that we're witnessing a fundamental reshaping of the international system. Think about it. Nuclear weapons have been this almost unbelievable aspect of the global order since World War II. For 80 years they've existed, offering an unimaginable advantage to those who possess them. Yet, they haven't been used in conflict since 1945. And for the most part, the vast majority of nations, outside of a select few, have accepted this profound imbalance in the international system. The non-proliferation movement, while driven by a very real fear of the catastrophic consequences of nuclear war, also serves the strategic interests of those who already have these weapons. Some of the most powerful countries on Earth. Building an independent nuclear capability is no small feat. It demands immense organizational, technological, and financial resources. However, let's not forget, we're talking about technology that's essentially 80 years old. Even countries like North Korea and Pakistan have it. So, it's not just the sheer difficulty of the process that has limited the spread of nuclear weapons. It's been the political ramifications and the structure of the international system itself. We often think of the Cold War as this incredibly tense and competitive period. And while there were certainly moments of intense rivalry between the US and the Soviet Union, in many ways, it was a surprisingly stable time. There was a clear line drawn in the sand, defining spheres of influence. Theorist Immanuel Wallerstein even suggested in one of his lectures that there was a sort of unspoken agreement between Washington and Moscow. This agreement allowed them to essentially manage fear within their respective zones of influence, roughly 2/3 and 1/3 of the globe. It was during this era that the concept of extended nuclear deterrence took hold. This idea, in essence, is that a stronger, nuclear-armed ally assures a weaker, non-nuclear ally that it will respond to aggression with its nuclear arsenal if necessary. Now, let's step back for a moment and think about this abstractly, without focusing on specific countries or alliances. Imagine state A guaranteeing state B that if B is attacked, A will use its nuclear weapons, thereby putting itself at risk of retaliation. What specific circumstances had to exist for such a network of commitments to even arise? And, more importantly, remain credible for decades? Beyond the stability of the Cold War system, the fact that neither side truly wanted to forcibly change the status quo, the key was the unwavering credibility of the stronger ally. But here's the crucial point. The realities of the Cold War are vastly different from today's. For example, during the Cold War, West Germany hosted around 200,000 American soldiers, famously including Elvis Presley. If the Soviets had made a move on Elvis, it was a clear signal that the US would respond with a massive nuclear attack on Moscow. More seriously, the sheer scale of conventional US forces in Europe significantly increased the likelihood of American involvement in any conflict, thus deterring Soviet aggression. In other words, these extended security guarantees, These extended nuclear guarantees were a bluff, but one nobody dared to call. Extended nuclear guarantees are a bluff that can only be tested by the aggressive use of nuclear weapons. But that in itself is also a bluff because the consequences, at least for now, are simply too enormous. We've been living for the past decade in a system that's essentially been running on the momentum of the previous era. The concepts and tools developed during the Cold War were simply transferred to the new system after the collapse of the Soviet Union, relying on inertia. For this system to endure, two main strategies were employed. First, to talk about nuclear weapons as little as possible. It's a profoundly uncomfortable topic. Once you start questioning the credibility of extended nuclear guarantees, a whole host of unprecedented problems and questions arise. The difficulty of this issue doesn't mean we should ignore it, especially as circumstances change so dramatically. The second strategy was to, in a way, mythologize and strongly emphasize nuclear non-proliferation. This reached a point of absurdity, I would argue, with the awarding of the 2009 Nobel Peace Prize to Barack Obama. He had barely settled into the White House, his belongings still being unpacked, and he received the prize for his contributions to nuclear non-proliferation. It felt incredibly detached from reality. But this inherited system, the one that followed World War II and the Cold War, the one that's been running on inertia for decades, is now coming to an end. And it's ending for several reasons, but in my view, two stand out. Firstly, the Russian Federation, a nuclear power, launched an aggressive campaign aimed at revising the international system, attacking countries that do not possess nuclear weapons. This is a fundamental development in the context of the nuclear debate. Secondly, the United States, a guarantor of security and nuclear deterrence, is undergoing a significant reorientation in its approach to the international order and the alliance system it built itself. These two factors together are creating a situation where the discussion about nuclear weapons among American allies and beyond is being reignited and intensified. While the Russian nuclear saber rattling might not be as prominent in the media as it was in the initial stages of the war, partly due to China's clear stance against any nuclear escalation, the underlying reality remains. Russia has nuclear weapons, and Ukraine does not. This disparity is a key factor shaping the conflict and likely its outcome. And this holds true, regardless of whether Russia actually uses its nuclear weapons. The mere threat of escalation to an unconventional war drastically alters the perspective of Ukraine's allies and Western countries on the Russian Federation. This is of paramount importance. This war starkly illustrates the different relationships countries have with nations that possess nuclear weapons versus those that don't. If Ukraine ultimately loses this war, meaning it doesn't secure its right to self-determination, and its political and economic future is largely dictated by Russia, then one of the reasons for this outcome will be the fact that Russia is a nuclear power and Ukraine is not. Again, this doesn't hinge on actual nuclear use. From the very beginning, from the probability of the war breaking out to how allies view Ukraine and assess the risks of further support, everything is influenced by this fundamental imbalance. The outcome of this war will likely lead every country bordering a revisionist nuclear power to fundamentally rethink its stance on nuclear weapons. Now, some might argue that Ukraine is a unique case, a country that wasn't covered by nuclear deterrence or genuine security guarantees. The Budapest Memorandum, often cited, did not provide hard security guarantees in exchange for Ukraine's nuclear disarmament. It's worth reading that document. It's only a page or two. But let's shift our focus to the United States. The U.S. is the second crucial factor in this evolving discussion, particularly among its allies. America is reevaluating its role in the international order it architected and its commitment to its alliance system. This is a reality we need to acknowledge. We can debate the extent of this reorientation and what America's true intentions are. Perhaps the U.S. simply wants its European allies to spend more on defense, to rebalance the alliance. Or maybe, some argue, the US wants to shed its traditional role entirely, viewing it as a burden and potentially even adopting a more revisionist stance towards the very system it created. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. However, regardless of America's ultimate goals, even the slightest reorientation from the US regarding its allies and the international system triggers discussions among those allies about security guarantees, especially nuclear guarantees provided by the US. When the President of the United States publicly questions whether they will defend an ally because that ally isn't spending enough on defense, it impacts American credibility, even if it's just rhetoric. When America discusses the status of its allies, it affects credibility, even if it's part of a larger strategy. Even if we take the most charitable view of American intentions, the current international circumstances force us to ask questions about security guarantees, including nuclear ones provided by the United States. And the most compelling evidence for this is the fact that one of the most pro-American politicians imaginable, the President of Poland, Andrzej Duda, a man hardly known for anti-American sentiment, directly stated in an interview with foreign press that it's time to move American nuclear warheads to Poland as part of nuclear sharing. To Poland. If President Duda believed American credibility was absolute and that Poland's status within NATO was unquestioned, he wouldn't have raised this issue in such a way. President Duda specifically mentioned that President Trump could potentially place American nuclear warheads currently stored in Western Europe or the US in Poland. He stated he recently discussed this with Keith Kellogg, a special envoy from the US to Ukraine. He pointed out that NATO's borders moved east in 1999, and therefore, 26 years later, NATO infrastructure should also move east. For me, it is obvious. President Duda said in his Financial Times interview, "I think that not only the time has come, but it would be safer if this weapon was already here." Now, Prime Minister Donald Tusk also weighed in during a speech in the Sejm, making it clear that Poland is reassessing its view on nuclear weapons. While he mentioned the French proposal of a European nuclear umbrella, he also strongly suggested that Poland might need to consider alternative actions, potentially even its own steps towards nuclear defense. While his statement was characteristically ambiguous, there was a clear suggestion that Poland isn't solely relying on alliance solutions. However, looking beyond the international situation and the behavior of allies like the US and Russia, it's difficult for me to imagine the current Polish state being capable of such a massive organizational undertaking. It might sound pessimistic, but given the nature of Polish politics today, where external pressure is often used to undermine the opposing political side, it's hard to see the necessary unity and focus. So, putting aside the significant international shifts required, the most crucial change needed for Poland to even consider such a path would be an internal one, a fundamental shift in how we think about our own country and its capabilities. In conclusion, I believe we can draw at least two key takeaways. Firstly, the very fact that this discussion is accelerating is a clear indication of the ongoing transformation of the international system. And until this system finds a new equilibrium, this discussion will continue and likely intensify. We might even reach a point where not talking about nuclear strategy becomes the anomaly. Secondly, for Poland, the question of nuclear weapons is once again a test of our status as a significant player within the Western world. This is a theme we've explored in many previous discussions. The current geopolitical game in Central and Eastern Europe directly impacts Poland's security, development, and future. Diplomatic and political efforts are underway to move Poland beyond its peripheral status within the alliance system. The issue of nuclear weapons reflects this peripheral status. So far, the results for Poland haven't been particularly optimistic, let's be honest. But as we say in Poland, nie ma tego złego, co by na dobre nie wyszło. There's nothing so bad that it wouldn't turn out for the good. This game isn't over, and much can still happen. I don't expect a resolution in the coming months. This will likely play out over the years. A lot depends on us, on whether we can change our mindset about our own country, and whether that shift can influence the political system to rethink Poland's role on the global stage. We need to move away from constantly seeking a patron. When it comes to nuclear weapons, this mentality, fueled by doubts about U.S. credibility, makes independent thinking about such technology incredibly difficult. But in any case, the discussion about nuclear weapons is just beginning, driven by the dynamic transformation of the international order. We'll see more statements from politicians, more analysis, and more books on this topic. I know Albert Świeżyński from Strategic Future is planning a book on this very subject, and I'm certainly curious to read it. So, fasten your seatbelts, everyone. These are the times we live in. And as part of this wider discussion, we will definitely be revisiting the topic of nuclear weapons here on the podcast. I hope this has provided some initial clarity on why Polish leaders have suddenly started talking more openly about this issue. Thanks for tuning in. Take care, and see you next time.